Imagine waking up in a small, noisy apartment above a bustling Roman street. Your shoes? Probably sandals that smell like yesterday's fish. Your job? Selling goods, carrying water, or maybe just surviving another day in Rome. You're not a senator, not a gladiator, not a poet. You're a common Roman citizen, and it's time for breakfast. Or maybe just a snack, because let's be honest, Rome had snacks too, and some of them were, well, wild. Grab a loaf of bread, maybe a fig, and hold on to your toga. Today, we're diving into the chaotic, crunchy, and often sticky world of ancient Roman junk food. If this is your first visit, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you can wander through the quirkiest, messiest, and occasionally terrifying moments of history with me. Today, we're exploring what Romans actually munched on when they weren't feasting in marble halls. Think street snacks, tavern treats, and desserts that might make your stomach question your life choices. Are you ready to see Rome through the eyes of its snack-addicted citizens? All right. Settle in. Maybe grab a cup of something warm and imagine you're stepping out into the sun-baked streets of Rome circa, let's say, the 1st century CE. You're not a senator, not a patrician with a villa and mosaic floors. You're a plebeian, maybe a baker, a porter, or a clerk sweating over scrolls in the forum. Life is loud, dusty, chaotic, and, importantly, hungry, really hungry. Because Rome doesn't pause, and neither do your stomach grumbles. You start your morning like any other Roman. The rooster crows somewhere in the alley behind your insula. Your sandals are crusted with yesterday's dirt, and your tunic smells faintly of yesterday's bread, yesterday's olives, and that mysterious pungent odor you hope is not. Well, never mind. The streets are alive. Merchants are shouting, donkeys bray, children dart between legs, chasing chickens or the occasional escaped goat. And in the middle of all this chaos, food. Everywhere. For sale, for barter, for survival, and, in some cases, just for sheer indulgence. Your first stop is the bread stall. Ah yes, the humble bread. But don't get cozy with your modern notions of soft, fluffy loaves. Roman bread was, well, it was a test of endurance. Hard, flat, and baked until it could double as a shield against a minor Roman skirmish. You bite into a piece and feel the grain scratch your gums in ways that modern dentistry would strongly advise against. The flour was coarse, the water inconsistent, and the yeast sometimes more a suggestion than an active participant. Still, bread was everything. Fuel for work, currency for exchange, and a simple pleasure between the chaos of life and the chaos of taxes. But bread alone doesn't fill your stomach or your curiosity. You glance over to the next stall, where a vendor is roasting nuts over hot coals. Pine nuts, almonds, chestnuts, some dusted with honey, others salted to a precise level of, you'll regret eating this much before lunch. You take a handful, crunching as you wander further. The smell of roasting nuts mingles with smoke, sweat, and the faint hint of the nearby latrine. Ah yes, Rome, city of contrasts. Your hands are sticky from honey, your tongue tingles from salt, and yet, somehow, you keep walking because there's more, always more. Turning the corner, the aroma changes, sharp, pungent, unmistakable. Fish, salted fish, dried fish, pickled fish. Someone somewhere thought, why settle for one type of stench when you can combine 3? The street vendor has trays of mullet, mackerel, and, wait, is that sardine paste on a skewer? You take a nibble. The salt is aggressive, the texture is chewy, and there may or may not be a small pebble hidden in the fillet. But hey, protein, energy, survival. You swallow and keep moving. Rome's streets are labyrinths of temptation. And now, you spot something truly exotic. Dormice, roasted, stuffed with minced meat, pine nuts, and a drizzle of honey. Yes, actual tiny mice. These weren't the pets in a modern terrarium. They were crunchy, caramelized, and the street equivalent of treat yourself. The vendor waves one at you like a prize. You hesitate. One bite? Worth it. You crunch, you chew, You question your life choices, and yet, somehow, you're hooked. Protein, carbs, honey glaze, your ancient Roman body approves. You continue past fruit vendors selling dates, figs, and grapes. Grapes are luxury if they're fresh, regular if they're shriveled, and hazardous if they're fermenting on the stall in the sun. Dates are dense, sticky, sometimes mixed with nuts or lightly roasted. You pick one up, sticky fingers now doubled with honey and fig paste, and bite. Instant energy, instant sugar rush, instant questioning of your decision to skip lunch. You shrug. Ancient Rome waits for no one. Nearby, you notice a small table with pastries. Now, pastry in Rome is not puffed, buttery, or flaky. No, Roman pastries were dense, heavy, and packed with enough flour, honey, and crushed nuts to give you mild whiplash if eaten too fast. The vendor shoves a small, round cake into your hand. It smells faintly like burnt honey and ambition. You bite, chewy, sticky, slightly nutty, and you now have honey glued to the roof of your mouth. But it's divine, sweet, messy, and utterly satisfying. Your journey continues to the tavern stalls. Here lies liquid energy, the Roman version of an energy drink mulsum. Wine mixed with honey, sometimes spiced with herbs, or flavored with a hint of dried fruits. It's thick, sticky, slightly fermented, and the moment it touches your tongue, your taste buds are assaulted by both sugar and alcohol. You blink, the sun is hot, and the vendor winks at you. A sip or two keeps you walking, keeps your spirits up, and prepares you for the next culinary adventure. But wait, it gets weirder. Across the street, someone is selling garum, fish sauce. Not just any fish sauce. Fermented fish guts in a jar, floating somewhere between liquid and slime. A Roman would drizzle it on everything. Bread, fish, meat, vegetables, possibly the air itself. You glance, you sniff, and you step back slowly. Yet locals crowd around, dipping crusts of bread into the viscous liquid. You try it, surprising. Salty, pungent, and somehow absolutely necessary. Yes, this is Rome. And yes, it works. Street foods weren't just about survival. They were entertainment. Vendors shouted their wares. Acrobats juggled bread loaves, and children ran wild between legs, occasionally grabbing honeyed nuts or figs from unattended baskets. Dogs weaved through the chaos, sniffing for dropped morsels, while cats lounged lazily in the sun, judging every purchase. A cacophony of smells, colors, textures, and minor chaos. And somehow, amidst all of this, your stomach is happy. Let's not forget the sweets. Honey cakes, dense barley pastries, and date treats. Some were small and portable, meant for workers hauling bricks or scribes hunched over scrolls. Others were lavish, meant for banquets or temple offerings. Honey wasn't just sugar. It was divine. Priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens alike revered its sweetness, sometimes dipping fruits or cakes into it as an offering to the gods. One bite, sticky fingers and all, and you feel momentarily blessed. And finally, the festivals. Imagine a street crowded with dancers, musicians, acrobats, and hundreds of hungry Romans. Every street corner is a market, every stall a treasure trove of snacks. Honey cakes shaped like animals, roasted nuts, skewered meat, fried fish, figs, dates, and jars of mulsum. It's overwhelming, messy, and magical. You grab whatever you can. Some roasted dormice, a honeyed date, a piece of dense pastry, and wander, sticky, sweet-toothed, and oddly satisfied. You've survived the street, the smells, and your own curiosity. Imagine your ancestors' idea of a vending machine. Someone waving a roasted dormouse at you while shouting, "Best protein in Rome!" No change, no receipt, just chew, swallow, and hope the gods are watching. The streets of Rome were chaotic, unpredictable, and endlessly flavorful. Snacks were fuel, ritual, comfort, and occasionally a challenge to your jaw and taste buds. And while emperors dined on exotic meats and imported delicacies, common Romans survived, thrived, and occasionally indulged in sticky, sugary, nutty, fermented delights. Life was hard, but Rome knew how to make it delicious, or at least memorable. By midday, you're sticky, sugar-crusted, and slightly buzzed from fermented mulsum. You pause, Wipe your hands on your tunic and look around. Merchants shout, children laugh, and somewhere a dog chews the remains of a date you dropped. Rome goes on. Street bustle, snacks vanish, and tomorrow it starts all over again. Bread, honey, garum, dates, pastries, and maybe, if you're lucky, a roasted dormouse. All right, grab your imaginary toga and prepare your taste buds, because now we're diving into the sweet side of ancient Roman life. Life on the streets is one thing. Bread, roasted nuts, garum, fish. But let's be honest, Romans had a serious sweet tooth. And when I say serious, I mean sticky fingers, jaw cramps, and sugar-induced ecstasy serious. First things first, honey. Oh, sweet golden honey, gift from the gods themselves, or at least from the local apiaries buzzing around the hills outside Rome. Honey wasn't just for flavor. It was medicine, currency, and the literal adhesive of Roman desserts. You wanted to survive the mid-morning heat? Honey. Needed to bribe a colleague or impress your neighbor? Honey. Offering at the temple? Definitely honey. It was everywhere. Sticky, sweet, and gloriously omnipresent. Now, honey doesn't work alone. It needed companions, co-stars in this Epicurean theater. Dates, figs, nuts of all varieties, almonds, walnuts, pine nuts, chestnuts, sometimes raw, sometimes roasted, sometimes ground into coarse paste. Mix these with honey, and suddenly you have a substance that could be used to glue together scrolls, tile floors, or your own teeth. Portability was key. Roman workers, soldiers, and laborers needed snacks that could endure the sun, the march, and occasional sandstorms. Honey cakes delivered. Sticky, dense, energy-packed, and slightly hazardous if dropped. Picture a small market stall on a bustling street. A vendor is frying what looks like flattened discs of dough in olive oil, while another jar of honey simmers nearby. The smell alone is intoxicating. Warm, sweet, slightly caramelized, with a hint of flour and fried goodness. You reach for one, and immediately your fingers are coated in golden syrup. It's fine. Let it drip onto your tunic. The Romans didn't care about mess. They cared about sustenance, flavor, and a sugar rush to survive the afternoon heat. These pastries came in all shapes and sizes. Round, flat, slightly domed, or molded into the form of animals, gods, or symbols of prosperity. One bite might give you honey, crunchy nuts, and dried fruit all at once. Another might deliver a sticky chew that clung to your teeth like it had personal ambitions. Either way, it was delicious, messy, and probably entirely indestructible unless baked to literal carbon. Romans didn't mess around with dessert. They made it strong enough to withstand the march, the marketplace, and your own enthusiasm. And don't think for a moment that these treats were limited to the plebeians. Wealthier Romans had their own decadent versions. Imagine honey cakes layered with almonds, infused with rosewater, and sprinkled with exotic spices like cinnamon, ginger, or even a hint of saffron. These were not just snacks. They were statements. Served at banquets, temples, or during Saturnalia, they were sweet declarations of wealth, piety, and good taste. And yes, the emperor himself probably had slaves dedicated solely to ensuring that every honey cake was sticky, dense, and perfect. Speaking of Saturnalia, the festival of excess, this is where Roman sweet-making really shines. Streets would fill with vendors selling honey-drenched pastries, figs stuffed with nuts, and candied fruits coated in honey. Children ran through the crowds, hands sticky, faces gleaming, and parents shouted instructions over the cacophony of drums, flutes, and the occasional braying donkey. It was chaos, sugar, and joy, all rolled into one. But not every treat was meant for the faint of stomach or faint of jaw. Enter the fig brick. Thick, dense, and sticky beyond reason. Fig bricks were essentially ancient energy bars on steroids. Figs, mashed, sometimes mixed with crushed nuts, dates, or even honey, then pressed into a rectangular form. You bite into one, and immediately your teeth recognize the challenge. Chew carefully, chew strategically. This isn't just food. It's survival training for your jaw. But it works. One brick can fuel a laborer hauling stone blocks, a soldier marching along the Appian Way, or a scribe hunched over scrolls in a stuffy room, scribbling laws that probably didn't care about their own health. Now, honey cakes weren't just about sustenance. They were portable. Soldiers marching across Italy, Gaul, or Hispania carried these sticky bricks in leather pouches. Workers heading to quarries or vineyards kept them in small baskets slung over shoulders. They were robust, dense, and energizing because Romans understood two things. Life is hard, and sugar helps you deal with it. Sure, your hands might stick to your tunic, your teeth might ache, and your sandals might pick up honey from the streets. But hey, energy counts, right? And let's not forget the vendors themselves. Roman street food sellers were experts at presentation, or as close as one could get with flour, honey, and a lot of improvisation. Some displayed pastries in neat rows, others piled them into chaotic towers. Occasionally, a stray bee would land on a cake. That was considered a blessing, not a nuisance. Honey wasn't just sweet, it was sacred. To drop a piece? Disaster. To bite a cake with a bee still clinging? Brave. To eat a honey cake the size of a brick? Legendary. Figs were another story. Dried, mashed, or boiled into sticky paste, figs were versatile, nutritious, and sometimes used as natural sweeteners in pastries. A fig cake might be combined with honey, nuts, and a sprinkle of sesame seeds. One bite. Crunchy, chewy, sweet, and vaguely gritty. Another. Sticky, rich, and potentially lodged in your teeth for days. But that was fine, because figs weren't just food. They were endurance. Survival fuel. Ancient Rome did not do dessert lightly. And then there were the dates. Sticky, dark, almost caramelized. These fruits were prized for their sweetness and long shelf life. Dates could be eaten alone, stuffed with nuts, or crushed into dense cakes. Soldiers, farmers, and traders relied on them for energy. Children sneaked them from stalls. Parents rolled their eyes. And sometimes, if the gods were feeling generous, you got a few in your hand as a reward for patience, cleverness, or surviving the midday sun without passing out. Romans also loved combinations. Dates and figs, roasted nuts and honey, sesame seeds sprinkled over sticky pastries. You bite, and immediately your taste buds are overwhelmed by sweetness, crunch, and chew. Fingers glued, jaw aching, and yet, inexplicably, you want more. The balance of flavors, textures, and sheer density of calories made these treats perfect for enduring the long, hot days of Rome. Yes, your fingers are sticky. Yes, your jaw is tired. Yes, this is your life now. Romans didn't do dessert lightly. One bite and you're officially part of the Roman economy. At festivals, the sweet side of Rome truly came alive. Saturnalia was the pinnacle of indulgence. The streets overflowed with vendors selling honey cakes, candied figs, and pastries the size of a small brick. Children ran, shouting, sticky fingers waving. Adults traded, laughed, and occasionally dropped coins directly into trays of pastries. The aroma was intoxicating. Sweet, rich, sometimes burnt, always overwhelming, and every bite carried the unspoken promise of temporary joy in a chaotic city. And yes, some sweets were meant for the gods. Temples displayed offerings, honey cakes shaped like animals, pyramids, or symbols of divine favor. Priests made sure the gods had their share. Mortals? Well, if a cake fell off the altar, lucky you. Sticky fingers, sugar rush, and the satisfaction of divine mishap. Portable snacks were everywhere. Soldiers marching through Gaul carried fig bricks. Laborers hauling stone blocks kept dates in small pouches. The Romans understood practicality. These treats lasted long, were dense, and packed energy in every bite. And if one fell in the dirt, well, the gods probably wouldn't mind, but your sandals would. By the afternoon, you've had honey, figs, dates, pastries, nuts, and maybe even a stray roasted dormouse if you were lucky. Fingers sticky, tunic smeared, teeth slightly glued together. You look around. The city is alive. Merchants shout, children laugh. Dogs chase each other through the streets, and the smell of roasting fish and honey hangs in the air like a permanent cloud. And so, Roman snacks weren't just fuel. They were ritual, joy, survival, and sometimes mild chaos in edible form. You chew a dense fig brick, bite into a honey-coated pastry, savor a sticky date, and marvel, life is messy, sweet, and endlessly surprising. The takeaway? Romans took dessert seriously. Sticky, dense, and deliciously challenging, these treats powered laborers, soldiers, scribes, and festival-goers alike. One bite, and your jaw aches, your fingers stick, and your spirit briefly soars. Energy, sweetness, and sheer determination wrapped in honey, flour, and ambition. So, next time you complain about dessert being too sweet or too messy, just remember, Romans once chewed fig bricks glued with honey, licked date syrup off their fingers, and somehow survived, probably powered by sheer stubbornness and sugar. Okay, take a deep breath and loosen that imaginary Roman toga. Because now we're diving headfirst into the liquid side of ancient Roman snacking. If you thought Romans were all about sticky figs and honey cakes, buckle up. Hydration in the Eternal City came with a twist, a bit of grit, and occasionally a floating insect or two. But don't worry, this is history we can sip on slowly, almost like a bedtime story, with just a splash of absurdity. First up, Pascha. Ah yes, Pascha, the drink of soldiers, laborers, and anyone looking to survive the midday sun without fainting over a stack of mud bricks. It's vinegar mixed with water, sometimes with a touch of herbs or salt, if the local vendor was feeling fancy. Now, before you grimace, consider the logic. Water alone was suspicious. Streams could be teeming with parasites. Stagnant pools were brewing grounds for bacteria. And no one wanted a case of dysentery mid-construction on the Appian Way. So, vinegar, with its acidity, acted as a primitive purifier. And yes, it tasted like sour sadness in a cup, but hey, it kept you alive. Soldiers marched on Pascha, sweat dripping, throat puckering, but somehow still alert enough to lob a spear or shout at the centurion. Imagine standing in a dusty camp outside Rome, the sun overhead like a molten bronze shield. A legionnaire reaches into his leather satchel and pulls out a small wooden cup. He dips it into a barrel of Pascha, the liquid sloshing over the rim, slightly cloudy, tangy, with an aroma somewhere between pickled onions and despair. He drinks, grimaces, and then somehow smiles at his comrades, because survival sometimes tastes like vinegar and sweat. Moving on to something a bit fancier, reserved for the wealthier citizens and occasionally for those willing to splurge at the tavern. Mulsum. Mulsum was wine sweetened with honey. Yes, honey again, because Rome clearly had a syrup addiction. Sweet, warm, and sometimes spiced with cinnamon or bay leaves, Mulsum was the ancient equivalent of spiked cider, minus the commercial bottling or calorie labels. You sip it slowly, savor the stickiness on your tongue, and suddenly, the world feels a little lighter, the toga a little less scratchy, and the sun a little less oppressive. Street culture around drinks was just as colorful as the beverages themselves. Imagine bustling markets in Rome, vendors shouting, coins clinking, and citizens navigating narrow streets with small cups of Mulsum, Pascha, or beer-like brews in hand. The working class had their version of beer, a thick, frothy concoction, more filling than intoxicating, often homebrewed from barley. It was gritty, chunky, and slightly sour, but it packed calories, hydration, and a morale boost for laborers hauling amphorae or tending livestock under the relentless Mediterranean sun. These beverages weren't just for drinking. Some were semi-solid, like a cross between porridge and liquid, thick enough to scoop with a spoon or, if you were desperate, lick off your fingers. A few street recipes combined beer with crushed bread or honey, producing a nutrient-dense, energy-packed snack that could sustain a laborer for hours. Yes, sticky. Yes, a little unappetizing by modern standards, but effective. Calories mattered more than elegance when building roads, walls, or aqueducts. Now, let's talk about taverns. Roman taverns were lively, sometimes rowdy, places where social interaction collided with beverage consumption. Patrons ranged from soldiers and merchants to craftsmen and casual loafers. The tavern smelled of barley, fermented honey, herbs, sweat, and occasionally something unidentifiable that probably shouldn't have been in a beverage at all. Cups were wooden or ceramic, sometimes reused multiple times without cleaning. Because, well, who had time for hygiene when you were running a tavern on the edge of civilization? Patrons drank, exchanged news, debated politics, and occasionally sang a song about Bacchus or the glories of last week's chariot race. Alcohol in Rome wasn't just indulgence. It was nourishment. Thick Pascha, Mulsum, and frothy beer. Like drinks supplied energy, hydration, and enough calories to sustain hard work. Soldiers marching long distances received a ration of pasca. Workers digging trenches or carrying amphorae got beer. Craftsmen, scribes, and messengers found their morale buoyed by a mug of mulsum in the evening. Drinks in Rome were practical, social, and a little hazardous. You might get a floating olive in your mulsum, a bit of crushed insect in your beer, or sediment from a poorly stirred barrel. But that was fine. It was flavor, history, and survival all at once. If your drink isn't thick enough to hold a floating olive or a small insect, you're not doing it right. Bonus points if you can still sip without grimacing. And of course, we cannot forget the ritual aspect of drinking. Wine was used in religious ceremonies, libations, and offerings to the gods. Pouring a small cup of mulsum onto the altar was seen as a sign of piety, respect, and occasionally desperation for divine intervention in matters of fertility, harvest, or avoiding a chariot accident. The gods might not have needed sugar, but the Romans certainly believed they deserved it. Street vendors sold smaller portions for quick refreshment. Frothy beer for a coin or two, mulsum in small cups for the ambitious passerby, pasca for the working man. The sensory experience was unforgettable. The aroma of fermentation, the tang of vinegar, the stickiness of honey, and the slight grit from crushed grains. Every sip carried history, culture, and the subtle reminder that Romans didn't do anything half-heartedly, including drinking. Occasionally, experimental concoctions appeared. Some alchemists, interested in medicine, added herbs, spices, or even bits of dried fruit to drinks. Imagine sipping pasca with a hint of coriander or mulsum infused with bay leaves. It was an acquired taste, sometimes medicinal, sometimes just plain strange. But it reflects the Roman obsession with enhancing life. Even their beverages, with a touch of science, superstition, or sensory challenge. Taverns themselves were small universes of social life. Patrons discussed everything from politics to the latest gladiator match, while nurses, soldiers, and scribes intermingled. The drink fueled these conversations. Words flowed as freely as the mulsum, and occasionally, arguments erupted, only to be cooled down by another round. Drinks weren't just about hydration. They were facilitators of diplomacy, gossip, and occasionally ill-advised wagers. Working-class Romans relied heavily on beverages as nutrition. Thick, frothy beer, pasca, and honeyed drinks were practical, calorically dense, and slightly intoxicating. A laborer could survive an entire day on bread and a mug of frothy barley beer, sometimes with a fig brick chucked in for dessert or emergency energy. Soldiers marching through Gaul, Hispania, or northern Italy drank pasca to stay hydrated, energetic, and reasonably sane. No beer pong, no frills, just survival. Now, picture this. A busy Roman street. Children run past, stealing sips of pasca from street vendors, while a baker trudges along with a basket of sticky honey cakes balanced precariously on his head. A legionnaire lumbers along, sweating under armor, clutching a mug of pasca. The smell, the sights, the stickiness, the taste it, all combines into a sensory overload. The city thrives, buzzing, sticky, and hydrated in its own peculiar way. And yes, mulsum occasionally had the side effect of a mild buzz, not the same as your modern happy hour, but enough to make a scribe forget about his ink-stained tunic or a soldier to march a few steps more energetically. Street culture around drinks was vibrant, communal, and sometimes sticky. Drinks weren't just beverages. They were catalysts of Roman life, moments of joy amidst labor, chaos, and construction dust. Imagine sipping a honeyed wine, thick enough that your fingers might stick together, and then realizing a passing pigeon might have contributed protein without asking. So, there you have it. Roman drinks were practical, messy, calorically dense, socially significant, and occasionally slightly terrifying. Pasca for the soldier, mulsum for the merchant, beer for the laborer, all sticky, all functional, all absolutely central to Roman life. Every sip carried energy, flavor, and a story. You drank to survive, to celebrate, to communicate, and sometimes to impress the gods. By the end of the day, after honey cakes, fig bricks, and sticky dates, a well-earned mug of thick, frothy pasca or mulsum was more than a drink. It was a reward, a sustenance ritual, and sometimes just a tiny miracle in a long sun-baked Roman day. Stickiness, sweetness, grit, and a touch of magic. And remember, Romans didn't drink lightly. If your beverage isn't doubling as snack, potion, and possibly a mild weapon for deterring pigeons, are you really living like a Roman? Bonus points if it doubles as a survival tool for marching, trading, or impressing the emperor. All right, take a deep breath, because now we're entering the wilder, stranger, and slightly terrifying side of Roman snacking. Exotic ingredients and culinary curiosities. Forget sticky dates, honey cakes, and fig bricks. This is where the Romans really let their taste buds run wild, testing the limits of flavor, texture, and possibly common sense. Let's start with flamingo tongues. Yes, you heard that right. Flamingo tongues. For the wealthy, these weren't just snacks. They were status symbols, conversation starters, and, occasionally, a way to make their dinner guests question their own life choices. Served at banquets with honeyed sauces or wine reductions, flamingo tongues were chewy, slightly gamey, and a marvel of audacity. A single bite could elicit awe, disgust, or polite nods as guests tried to hide their hesitation. Imagine attending a lavish feast in the heart of Rome. The triclinia, dining room, is filled with flickering oil lamps, the aroma of roasting meats and baking bread hanging in the air. A slave approaches with a platter of exotic delicacies: roasted dormice stuffed with pine nuts, flamingo tongues, and slices of spiced ostrich. You pick up a flamingo tongue, glance at your neighbor, and nod. They nod back. The unspoken agreement: we are sophisticated, daring, and slightly insane. Dormice were another delicacy, often fattened on nuts and grains before being roasted or stuffed. Street versions existed too smaller, less glamorous, and usually with a slightly burnt crust. But for the elite, these little creatures were a snack fit for a Caesar. A dormouse in a pastry shell, coated with honey and sprinkled with pepper, was part dessert, part protein, and part eccentric display of wealth. And then there's garum, the ultimate flavor bomb of Roman cuisine. Fermented fish sauce, pungent enough to make modern noses recoil. Garum was everywhere. A few drops could transform plain bread, boiled vegetables, or even a roasted dormouse into a dish of unparalleled complexity. Or, depending on your taste, an olfactory assault. It was salty, umami, tangy, and carried the distinct aroma of "I've definitely been sitting in the sun for too long." Imagine trading 3 jars of garum for a loaf of bread. That's roughly like bartering Bitcoin for a hot dog today. Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it was worth it. The wealthier the Roman, the more elaborate the culinary displays. Exotic ingredients weren't just for taste. They were social signals. Flamingo tongues, peacock brains, stuffed sows' wombs. The more outrageous, the higher the status. A banquet was part theater, part politics, and part sensory challenge. If your guest blanched at the sight of a stuffed dormouse, you'd smile and nod, silently asserting your superiority. Dining in Rome was as much about ego as it was about sustenance. Commoners didn't get to dine on dormice or flamingo tongues, of course. Their culinary creativity was less glamorous but equally resourceful. Street vendors sold more accessible versions. Small pastries stuffed with legumes or cheaper meats, flatbreads coated with honey and crushed nuts, and garum-spiced fish cakes. The flavors were similar in principle: sweet, salty, pungent, but scaled to survival and affordability rather than status. A Roman plebeian might daydream of exotic banquets while chewing a garum-coated fish, patty, fingers sticky, nose twitching, and stomach surprisingly content. Spices played a huge role in this. Black pepper, cumin, coriander, and asafoetida weren't just flavor enhancers. They were symbols of trade, wealth, and global reach. The wealthy Roman household could afford imported spices from India, Arabia, and North Africa, giving dishes a complex bouquet that few commoners could replicate. For the average person, a pinch of locally grown herbs would have to suffice, and fermentation added its own dimension. Fish sauces, cured meats, and wine reductions were all part of a careful balance of preservation, taste, and social signaling. Take the example of spiced dormice. Imagine tiny rodents, fattened and roasted, then coated with a honey glaze and sprinkled with crushed peppercorns. One bite, crunchy skin, sticky honey, nutty interior, fiery spice. An orchestra of sensations. Another bite, unexpected bitterness, maybe a rogue whisker, and the faint undertone of "what did I just commit to eating?" It was bold, messy, and entirely Roman. Street vendors tried to emulate these luxurious flavors for the masses. Perhaps not flamingo tongues, but small birds, sausages, or fish cakes coated in garum and honey. The goal was clear: taste and novelty. With just a pinch of danger, you ate, survived, and moved on to the next stall, fingers sticky, tunic smeared, and tongue slightly scorched from exotic spices. Exotic foods also carried practical purposes. Dense pastries, sticky honey cakes, and fermented fish sauces provided calories, preservation, and energy for workers, soldiers, and travelers. A soldier marching along the Via Appia could carry a fig brick in one hand, a small cup of mulsum in the other, and survive a day of hard labor without passing out. The edible materials were compact, calorie-dense, and slightly terrifying if inspected too closely, but they worked. Imagine trading 3 jars of garum for a loaf of bread. That's roughly like bartering Bitcoin for a hot dog today. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Delicious? Subjective. Exotic culinary curiosities weren't just about flavor. They were experiences. Eating flamingo tongues, dormice, or garum-spiced fish was about proving you had the wealth, taste, and stomach to survive in Roman society. Banquets became stages for experimentation, indulgence, and, occasionally, embarrassment. A noble might declare a dish divine, while secretly hoping the dish didn't include any unexpected feathers, claws, or teeth. Even commoners engaged with the curiosity of these foods, though on a smaller scale. Street snacks mimicked luxury ingredients: nuts and honey for flamingo tongues, small fish for dormice, and garum as the eternal flavor enhancer. The creativity was undeniable. Bread could be flattened, stuffed, baked, and drenched in honey to approximate the grandeur of a noble dessert. Energy, survival, and a touch of aspiration, all rolled into one. And then there were festival treats, which took the exotic to a new level. Religious ceremonies and public holidays demanded dishes that dazzled, perplexed, and often overwhelmed. Honey-glazed pastries, fig bricks the size of a hand, garum-spiced pies, and sometimes even roasted birds stuffed with dates or herbs. All were designed to impress the gods, delight the wealthy, and shock the average spectator. Yes, your fingers are sticky. Yes, your jaw is tired. Yes, this is your life now. Romans didn't do dessert lightly. If your mouth isn't simultaneously delighted and terrified, you're doing it wrong. For workers, soldiers, and everyday Romans, these exotic treats had a dual purpose. They were both nourishment and morale boosters. Calorie-dense, portable, and slightly indestructible. One bite of a honey-coated fig brick, one taste of mulsum-spiced dates, and suddenly a laborer hauling stone blocks or a soldier marching along the empire's roads felt a little more human, a little more alive, and a little less like a cog in Rome's relentless machinery. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Sticky, sweet, spicy, salty, pungent, all at once. You bite into a dessert. Your tongue is assaulted by honey and spice. Your teeth crunch over nuts. Your fingers glisten with syrup. And somewhere, a fish sauce jar drips unnoticed into the street. You shrug, lick your fingers, and move on. This was daily life in Rome. A little chaos, a little survival, a lot of sugar, and sometimes, just sometimes, a moment of pure indulgence. By the end of the day, after figs, dates, dormice, flamingo tongues, and jars of garum, you'd be sticky, full, and slightly delirious. But also remarkably Roman. Energy sustained, social hierarchy observed, taste buds bewildered, and stomach surviving the chaos of daily life. Dessert wasn't a snack, it was a statement. And there you have it. Roman sweets, exotic ingredients, and culinary curiosities in all their sticky, flavorful glory. From flamingo tongues to garum, figs to honey cakes, each bite tells a story of survival, indulgence, and occasionally reckless bravery. Hunger? Solved. Taste? Chaotic. Social status? Absolutely displayed. Fingers sticky, jaw tired, and a story to tell the gods themselves. If your dessert doesn't require careful maneuvering to avoid a syrupy disaster, you're not eating like a Roman. And remember, garum can be traded, figs can be dropped, but your status? That's all you, buddy. All right, my toga-wearing friends, let's take a seat at the Roman table figuratively for now, because if we're doing it literally, Your knees might get stuck under a low triclinium couch and someone will judge your posture. Today, we explore the social heartbeat of ancient Rome. The way Romans ate, snacked, and somehow managed to keep their dignity, or at least try. Spoiler alert. Chaos, aromas, and sticky fingers abound. Let's start with daily snacking habits. Yes, the Romans were snackers, though not in a modern grab a granola bar and scroll your phone kind of way. Their day often began with bread dipped in olive oil or sprinkled with a touch of honey. Mid-morning, the laborers might nibble on figs, dates, or a small pastry stuffed with nuts. After work, perhaps a fig brick or a honey cake to reward yourself for surviving the afternoon heat without collapsing into the nearest river. Late-night indulgences? Absolutely, especially during festivals, religious ceremonies, or when someone needed an excuse to eat more than their body demanded. Eating was never just about nutrition. It was energy, celebration, survival, and occasionally an art form of sticky indulgence. Now, contrast this with the noble household. Imagine a dining room in a domus, polished marble floors, oil lamps casting a golden glow, and a slave or two, maybe even 3, hovering behind every guest with trays of honey cakes, figs, and tiny pastries shaped like peacocks. The table is crowded, filled with plates of roasted dormice, exotic fruits, nuts, and honeyed delicacies. Patrons recline on their couches, carefully balancing food in one hand and wine in the other, discussing politics, poetry, or the scandal involving the senator's daughter. Precision, etiquette, and appearances were everything. One misplaced fig, a subtle glance, a raised eyebrow, a whispered reprimand. And then there's the street scene, which couldn't be more different. Imagine narrow cobbled streets, vendors shouting, chickens weaving through your ankles, and the smell of roasted meat, fermenting honey, and occasionally fish hitting your nostrils. A street snack? Pick a pastry, dip it in honey, bite, chew, get a surprise crunch of a stray nut or pebble, and move on. No finesse, no elegance, no pretense. You ate fast, ate messy, and kept one eye on your coin purse. Street food was functional, social, and sometimes mildly hazardous, but it was vibrant, alive, and available to anyone with enough coin. The noble family ate with finesse. The street vendor ate like a hurricane hit a table, fingers sticky, tunic smeared, and eyes wide with delight or terror. It was all part of the experience. Food in Rome was deeply communal. Meals were noisy, aromatic, and full of conversation. Whether in a crowded domus or a bustling tavern, eating was as much about connection as it was about sustenance. Patrons chewed loudly, sipped their mulsum, and gestured dramatically with fig-filled hands. Conversations overlapped with the clatter of plates, the pop of wine amphorae, and the occasional squawk of a distracted chicken wandering into the kitchen. Romans understood that eating together was social glue that bonded families, workers, soldiers, and neighbors, creating community amid the chaos of daily life. And speaking of chaos, let's talk about taverns. Taverns were the street-level counterpart to noble dining rooms, filled with energy, aromas, and unpredictable entertainment. You could grab a mug of thick, frothy beer, a slice of honey cake, and witness a minor argument between a merchant and a drunk soldier escalate into a full-scale brawl over the last fig brick. Taverns were less about manners and more about efficiency. Drink, eat, gossip, survive. The ambiance was sensory overload smells of fermented grain, roasted meats, and honey mingled with the heat of summer, the sweat of patrons, and the occasional stray dog hoping for a snack. Dietary contrasts were stark. Plebeians survived on bread, legumes, figs, and whatever street snacks they could afford. A mid-morning fig or date might be their highlight. Calories were earned through labor, and flavor was secondary. Patricians, on the other hand, enjoyed delicacies imported from across the empire. Spiced honey cakes, dates stuffed with nuts, roasted dormice, and flamingo tongues. Their meals were orchestrated performances, showcasing wealth, taste, and social status. Street snacks were functional. Noble feasts were both functional and theatrical. Even within the household, social hierarchy dictated who ate what and when. Slaves and servants would often consume leftovers, scraps, or items deemed unfit for their masters. The distribution of food reinforced societal structures. The wealthiest ate first and most elaborately. while the lowest tiers chewed through scraps with gratitude, creativity, and sometimes fear of the next reprimand. Eating was not just sustenance. It was a lesson in Roman society, hierarchy, and survival. Festivals amplified this social and culinary drama. Take Saturnalia, the festival of chaos, indulgence, and temporary social inversion. Masters served slaves, honey cakes, alongside figs and pastries, temporarily blurring social lines. Streets overflowed with food vendors, musicians, dancers, and crowds eager for indulgence. Sticky fingers, laughter, and sweet aromas filled the air. Even the most structured households allowed for temporary abandonment of strict etiquette. Because sugar, honey, and figs have a way of softening the edges of hierarchy, if only for a day. Romans also loved combining flavors and textures in novel ways. Honey might coat a pastry, sprinkled with nuts, stuffed with dates, and served alongside a small cup of mulsum. Fig bricks could include crushed nuts, herbs, or even a hint of wine. The contrast of textures: sticky, chewy, crunchy, soft created a multi-sensory experience. Eating wasn't just a mechanical act. It was a performance, a survival tool, and sometimes a sensory gamble. Yes, your fingers are sticky. Yes, your jaw is tired. Yes, you are slightly terrified by the crunch of unknown nuts hidden in a fig brick. And yes, this is your life now. Welcome to being Roman. Even late-night snacks played a role. Romans didn't always wait for structured meals. Nighttime hunger? Grab a honey cake, a fig brick, or a leftover date paste pastry. Some soldiers, returning from distant campaigns, ate portable snacks on the road dense, sweet and able to survive a week in a leather pouch. Laborers might finish their day with a sweet bread dipped in mulsum, licking sticky fingers under the moonlight. Snacks weren't indulgence. They were survival, energy, and morale in edible form. Spices and exotic flavors further complicated dining culture. Pepper, cumin, coriander, and even saffron might appear in noble pastries, while street versions relied on locally available herbs. These subtle additions elevated simple foods into status symbols. One bite, honey and figs. Another bite, honey, figs, nuts, and pepper. One was street snack, the other, imperial indulgence. Both were memorable. Both were sticky. Both had the potential to glue your jaw shut. Taverns also served as hubs for liquid snacks, as we covered in the previous section: mulsum, pasca, frothy beer. But pairing these beverages with sticky pastries, honey cakes, and fig bricks elevated both items. One bite of a honey-coated fig brick, one sip of thick mulsum, and suddenly, you're not just eating. You're performing a ritual of survival, indulgence, and slightly reckless pleasure. If your fingers aren't sticky, your mouth isn't full, and your tunic isn't smeared, are you even Roman? And yes, that's entirely the point. The aromas of Roman dining were overwhelming. Freshly baked bread, caramelizing honey, roasted nuts, dried figs, and spiced pastries all mingled in the air. In noble houses, servants moved trays with precision, ensuring that each guest received the correct pastry, while street vendors shouted to sell their sticky wares. In both scenarios, eating was an event, sensory, social, and slightly hazardous to your tunic. For plebeians, meals reinforced community. Sharing a fig brick, passing around a honey cake, or enjoying a small cup of frothy beer was more than sustenance. It was a connection. For patricians, meals reinforced hierarchy, wealth, and taste. Banquets displayed status, sophistication, and the ability to indulge in sensory extravagance without the threat of sticky fingers sticking to your tunic permanently. Romans understood that food was performance, survival, and indulgence all at once. A street vendor's fig brick might carry the same caloric load as a noble's honey cake, but one was eaten for survival, the other for prestige. Yet both were celebrated, enjoyed, and sticky. Sugar, honey, and calories were universal. Ah, Rome, the city of aqueducts, emperors, and culinary roulette. Yes, my friends, after we've indulged in honey cakes, fig bricks, and flamingo tongues, it's time to discuss a slightly more sobering aspect of Roman dining: food safety. Because while the snacks were delicious, the consequences of a wrong bite could be, let's just say, memorable. Let's start with street hygiene. Picture a bustling Roman street in the height of summer. Vendors shouting, goats wandering through the dust, and children darting between stalls, their sandals crunching on stray bits of bread. Now imagine a honey cake sitting exposed on a tray in the sun for hours. A little dust? Fine. A fly or two? Traditional seasoning. Bits of sand from the street? Considerate texture. The average Roman probably shrugged and took a bite anyway, because hunger, social pressure, and the fear of missing out on sticky sweets overruled concerns about microscopic invaders. Spoiled ingredients were another ever-present danger. Olive oil could turn rancid. Honey could ferment unexpectedly. Figs and dates could develop mold or harbor insects. And fermented fish sauces, garum, could reach levels of pungency. Even the most courageous stomach would question. And yes, Romans often consumed these ingredients anyway. They had faith, superstition, and occasionally sheer stubbornness on their side. A little spoilage? Perhaps a minor stomach ache. A major spoilage? Well, you'd better hope you were sitting near a latrine. Parasites were everywhere, invisible and relentless. Tapeworms, roundworms, and other freeloaders of the digestive tract were common companions for Romans who relied on street snacks, riverside fish, or improperly stored grain. The symptoms ranged from mild discomfort to dramatic collapses mid-market. A noble might sneeze politely while suffering intestinal rebellion, while a plebeian might stagger home holding a fig brick in one hand, wincing and muttering under their breath, "Maybe the gods will forgive me." Romans also relied on superstitions and ritual remedies to navigate these culinary dangers. A lucky charm hung over the kitchen, an incense stick burned to ward off invisible spirits in the food, or a small prayer whispered over garum before adding it to a dish. Herbal cures abounded. Fever? Boil some rue leaves and sniff the steam. Digestive upset? Swallow a mix of honey, pepper, and a pinch of fennel. Some remedies worked. Many were placebo, and a few might have worsened the condition. But hey, effort counts. One bite of the wrong fish, and suddenly your stomach is a personal amphitheater for Roman chaos. You might clutch your abdomen, dash for the latrine, and swear never to eat something from that vendor again until tomorrow. Accidental poisoning was another feature of Roman snack life. A poorly prepared dormouse, a fish left too long in the sun, or a honeyed pastry with an overzealous spice mix could lead to dramatic consequences. Romans were aware, slightly terrified, but largely cavalier. Herbs, vinegar, wine, and amulets were used to mitigate the damage. Sometimes a citizen would spend hours nibbling honey cakes, praying to the household gods, and hoping their stomach didn't start a civil war. Street vendors often took minimal precautions, not out of negligence, but out of necessity. Keep the pastries in the sun for aroma and appeal, let the fish ferment for flavor, and if someone got a mild stomach ache, well, free advertising, because everyone would talk about it. Social pressure, not sanitation, kept markets alive. And the Romans had a certain flair for risk-taking. That one sticky fig brick might harbor a surprise beetle or two, but the joy of consuming it outweighed the microscopic hazard. Imagine biting into a honey cake only to realize the fly that landed during your snack has taken permanent residence. That's just bonus protein, right? Fermented foods added another layer of danger. Garum, wine, and thick honeyed beverages could hide invisible threats. While fermentation preserved some foods, it could also amplify bacterial growth if conditions weren't ideal. A batch of mulsum left in the sun too long? Congratulations, you've invented a cocktail of risk. A jar of garum not cleaned properly, bonus pungency, and a surprise stomach challenge. The line between flavor and gastrointestinal hazard was thin, and the Romans walked it with pride, forkless, fingers sticky, and eyes gleaming with anticipation. Exotic ingredients added their own hazards. Flamingo tongues, dormice, and even snails were often prepared with elaborate spices, honey, or sauces. Sometimes the combination was perfect, resulting in a sublime taste. Other times, the textures clashed, the spice was too intense, or the protein had gone slightly off. The consequences? Upset stomach, temporary regret, and occasional dramatic collapses mid-banquet. Yet Romans rarely learned their lesson. Novelty, taste, and status outweighed gastrointestinal safety every time. For the plebeians, the risks were slightly different, but equally dramatic. Street snacks, figs, and pastries were affordable, delicious, and occasionally perilous. Sand, grit, and rogue insects were all part of the texture. If a fig had begun to ferment naturally under the sun, well, congratulations, you've discovered bonus alcohol in your midday snack. Survival required a blend of bravery, appetite, and slightly reckless optimism. In the wealthy households, precautions were somewhat stricter, but not foolproof. Slaves and cooks worked to avoid spoiled ingredients, but mistakes happened. A batch of honey cakes could overcook, a dormouse might retain an extra feather, or a jar of garum might emit an olfactory punch capable of clearing a room. Even the most refined Romans sometimes fell victim to a small culinary catastrophe. Apologies were whispered, incense was burned, and the snack was eaten anyway, because pride and sugar demanded it. Imagine someone politely nibbling a dormouse pastry while silently praying that the garum sauce hasn't developed sentience overnight. That's Roman dining in a nutshell. Even festivals came with their own hazards. During Saturnalia, sticky pastries, honey cakes, and fermented treats were everywhere. Often unattended, children darted through crowds, inadvertently contaminating snacks with sand, dirt, or an unfortunate bird contribution. Adults consumed these treats, trusting in superstition, luck, and perhaps a slightly overconfident stomach. The combination of sugar, stickiness, and mild microbial chaos made for an unforgettable, if slightly terrifying, culinary experience. Alcoholic beverages weren't immune to risk either. Mulsum, thick and sweet, could ferment unpredictably if stored in warm conditions. Posca might harbor a hint of unexpected mold. Frothy beer could separate, leaving a suspicious sediment at the bottom of the cup. Yet Romans drank, soldiers marched, workers labored, and children occasionally snuck sips, all with a casual shrug at the potential consequences. Survival, taste, and the pursuit of pleasure outweighed concern for a little gastronomic danger. By the end of the day, after honey cakes, fig bricks, dates, and garum-spiced snacks, a Roman stomach might feel like a battleground. Fingers sticky, tunic smeared, and mouth coated with a mix of sweet, salty, and pungent flavors. But that was life. One bite could be bliss, the next could be chaos. Either way, it was exciting, communal, and unforgettable. One bite of the wrong fish, and suddenly your stomach is a personal amphitheater for Roman chaos. You'll be performing scenes of nausea and despair in private, all while secretly craving another fig brick to stabilize morale. So, next time you munch a fig or dab honey on your toast, remember, a Roman might have done it with one eye on a passing pigeon, one hand sticky with honey, and the other praying to the household gods that the dormouse they just roasted didn't come back to haunt them. One wrong nibble and your stomach is performing gladiatorial combat. One right nibble and your mouth is partying like it's Saturnalia. Either way, you're fully Roman. All right, fellow time traveler, fasten your sandals because today we're diving headfirst into the chaotic, aromatic, and delightfully sticky world of Roman festivals and markets. If you thought snacking in your kitchen was risky, you haven't experienced the full sensory assault of a Roman food festival. We're talking about streets jammed with people, vendors shouting, pigs squealing, and enough smoke, incense, and roasting meat to fog your vision and singe your eyebrows. Welcome to the edible theater of ancient Rome. Let's start with the market days. Picture the forum at dawn, the air crisp with the promise of chaos and stale bread. Stalls pop up as if by magic, though in reality, it's a lot of sweaty labor, early rising, and shouting vendors. One man sells barley bread. Another displays honey cakes, sticky enough to glue a shoe to the table. A vendor nearby flips small pastries over hot stones, occasionally muttering prayers to Fortuna that the dough doesn't stick or explode. Street dogs weave between your sandals, hoping for a dropped fig or a forgotten date. Children dart through legs, shrieking with glee, carrying tiny bundles of nuts, figs, and whatever else their parents permitted them to steal without actually asking. Yes, there's roasted goose, wine, pastries, and someone selling dried snakes. You're not dreaming. This is ancient Rome. One sniff and your senses might just revolt in unison. On market days, snacking isn't a side activity. It's part of survival. A Roman citizen might start with a piece of flatbread, sneak a sticky date, and then, just for balance, sip mulsum or a frothy beer-like concoction called cervisia. The mix of sweet, sour, and slightly fishy is an acquired taste. Your neighbors chew alongside you, one grinning, one grimacing, one quietly muttering a prayer over the olive oil. Everyone is in the same boat, or in this case, dodging the same chickens. Now, festival days take the chaos to a whole new level. Saturnalia, for instance, was the crown jewel of indulgence. Masters served food alongside their slaves, gifts were exchanged, and social norms were temporarily suspended. Gluttony wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Imagine roasted meats sizzling over open flames, honey dripping from figs and cakes like molten gold, and street performers juggling pastries while playing lyres. The smell alone was intoxicating, capable of drawing the hungriest beggar and the most reserved patrician into a shared frenzy. Street food during festivals wasn't just practical, it was performance. Vendors shouted over one another, their voices straining to carry over flutes, drums, and the chatter of thousands. Fresh figs, sticky honey cakes, dormice roasted to perfection. A musician's tune accompanies your purchase. A dog jumps on your foot. A child spills your beer. The experience is equal parts snack, theater, and mild panic. The line between eating and survival blurs, and your senses are assaulted by aroma, touch, taste, and noise. The religious dimension of festivals adds even more spectacle. Offerings of cakes, honey, and wine were made to gods like Saturn, Bacchus, or Ceres. Temples would display elaborate spreads, loaves shaped like animals, pastries shaped like symbols, jars of wine reserved for the divine. Humans got the leftovers, often slightly stale, but still more than sufficient to feel a spark of joy in an otherwise labor-intensive day. A Roman citizen could eat, pray, and speculate on divine favor all at once. Somehow, between bites of honey-soaked bread and chunks of roasted poultry, everyone managed to feel both pious and overfed. Now let's talk about temporary street food stands, which were essentially the ancient version of pop-up food trucks, but dirtier, louder, and more likely to involve a live goat. These stands served portable snacks to workers, travelers, and festival-goers. A patrician might look down on the plebeian's portable nutcakes, but the plebeian didn't care. They were too busy dodging livestock and sampling fried dough balls filled with dates. Each stall was a microcosm of Roman ingenuity. Pastries fried in olive oil, nuts coated in honey, and fish smoked just enough to avoid complete decomposition. Some vendors even offered novelty items: marinated dormice, small birds skewered and roasted, or garum-drizzled pastries which your stomach might politely reject. But hey, curiosity is a Roman virtue, right? You might think roasted goose was impressive, but wait until a vendor hands you a spiced dormouse on a skewer and winks. Congratulations, you've reached peak Roman street snack adventure. Social interaction was inseparable from food. Markets and festivals were crowded, noisy, and utterly communal. Eating was a performance as much as a necessity. A Roman citizen might attempt to savor their honey cake while balancing a jug of wine, defending their purchases from pickpockets, and nodding politely to the senator who's sneaking a slice of date bread. Everyone's fingers are sticky. Everyone's jaw is tired. And yet, no one complains. Because this is life. And life is delicious chaos. The festival food itself deserves a deeper look. Honey cakes, fig bricks, date-filled pastries, and garum-spiced snacks were only the beginning. Roasted meats were everywhere. Ducks, geese, and even small animals carefully skewered and basted. Nuts and dried fruits were piled high, sometimes coated with honey or spices. Workers and artisans bought their treats to tide them over while assisting in games, building floats, or hauling festival props. Even children participated, balancing small treats in their hands while running through streets filled with the scent of smoke, sweat, and baked dough. Yes, your hands are sticky, your tunic smells like roasted goose and honey, and there's a chicken scratching at your sandal. Welcome to Roman festival dining. It's multi-sensory chaos. Entertainment and food intertwined seamlessly. Jugglers tossed figs and pastries into the crowd. Minstrels sang of Bacchus's exploits while spectators gnawed on honeyed snacks. Gladiators might pause mid-performance to consume a portable fig brick, acknowledging that survival sometimes takes precedence over fame. Vendors shouted offers, children ran amok, and adults tried to maintain dignity while sticky honey seeped into their tunics. The festival was part market, part theater, part feast, and entirely Roman. The role of alcohol in festival culture cannot be understated. Mulsum, pasca, and spiced wines flowed freely. Soldiers and laborers consumed beer-like beverages for calories and hydration, while the wealthy sipped honeyed wine, attempting elegance despite sticky fingers. The combination of sugar, alcohol, and chaotic movement ensured everyone was slightly tipsy, slightly sticky, and wholly immersed in the experience. One sip might be refreshing. 10 sips, a gamble with both coordination and dignity. Finally, consider the status signaling inherent in food choice. Exotic ingredients, flamingo tongues, dormice, imported spices were flaunted by the wealthy to display power and sophistication. Plebeians attempted imitations using more common ingredients: figs, dates, nuts, and fermented sauces. The result? Delicious, messy, and sometimes confusing to modern taste buds. Even without exotic luxuries, the act of eating and sharing was what mattered. A roasted goose might impress, but the communal act of consuming, laughing, and negotiating sticky snacks was the true spectacle. Yes, there's roasted goose, wine, pastries, and someone selling dried snakes. You're not dreaming. This is ancient Rome. If your stomach survives, consider it a victory. If your fingers survive, consider yourself blessed. And if your dignity survives, well, that's optional. Markets and festivals were also educational, political, and cultural hubs. As you nibbled your sticky fig, you could overhear senators arguing, merchants bargaining, or philosophers pontificating. Eating wasn't just for sustenance, it was a civic act, a moment of connection. Every bite reinforced community, identity, and social order, even as chaos and sensory overload reigned supreme. By the end of the festival day, your fingers sticky, your tunic smeared, your jaw exhausted from chewing tough pastries, and your stomach stuffed with figs, honey, dates, and roasted meat, you might reflect on one thing. Rome loved food, spectacle, and chaos in equal measure. The intertwining of sustenance and entertainment, community and indulgence created a world where eating was an experience, not a chore. And so, fellow traveler, remember, the next time you pick up a snack, consider the Roman approach. Treat it with joy, a little caution, and perhaps a prayer to the household gods. Sticky fingers? Acceptable. Spilled honey? Inevitable. Rogue insect? Bonus protein. Welcome to the festival. Welcome to the market. Welcome to Rome, where snacking is a performance, a gamble, and occasionally a risk to your digestive harmony. By the time the final fig brick is eaten and the last draught of mulsum swallowed, you've survived Roman festival dining. Fingers sticky, stomach full, and spirit slightly in awe. And somehow, you can't wait for tomorrow's chaos. So, now that we've chewed our way through sticky honey cakes, chewy fig bricks, frothy pasca, and the occasional spiced dormouse, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The legacy of Roman snacking. Because believe it or not, your modern candy bar, granola bite, or street-side churro owes more to the ingenuity of ancient Rome than you might think. First off, Roman street foods were about resourcefulness. You had laborers hauling bricks, farmers sweating under the sun, and scribes hunched over scrolls scribbling Latin like their lives depended on it, which, in some ways, they did. These people needed portable, calorie-dense, and cheap foods that could survive a day of work in the sun. Enter the honeyed fig, the date brick, the fried pastry, the ancestors of modern energy bars. Thick, sticky, sweet, and slightly sandy. These snacks were designed to fuel the body, satisfy the taste buds, and survive being shoved into a satchel or pocket. Next time you grab a candy bar, thank Rome. Or at least be grateful it's not a fried dormouse wrapped in barley paste. The fermented beverages we mentioned, beer like cervisia, mulsum, and other spiced wines, also left their mark. Romans recognized that these drinks weren't just for pleasure. They were nutrition, hydration, and sometimes even medicine. Beer for the working class, honey wine for the wealthy, and spiced mixtures for religious ceremonies, all were practical, portable, and calorie-packed. Modern brewing techniques owe a nod to these early experiments. Sure, they didn't have IPA, lager, or nitro stout, but they understood the value of fermented grains and honey, and more importantly, they drank responsibly as one can while balancing a loaf of bread, a fig brick, and a goblet full of floating barley. Then there's the cultural legacy of communal eating. Roman festivals, market days, and temple offerings weren't just about food. They were about gathering. Eating together created bonds, reinforced social hierarchies, and allowed gossip, politics, and philosophy to intermingle with crumbs of honey cake and dribbles of wine. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of networking events, but with better sugar content. That concept of food as a social glue echoes in modern European cafe culture, public markets, holiday feasts, and yes, the occasional food festival where you might accidentally bite into a deep-fried octopus while watching a mime. In ancient Rome, your snack could start a conversation, end a rivalry, or inspire a philosophical debate. And sometimes all three at the same time. With fig juice on your tunic. The Romans also taught future generations about indulgence with a purpose. Sweets were rarely just for pleasure. They were functional. Dates, figs, nuts, honey, and pastries provided energy for laborers, soldiers, and festival goers. Even the rich indulged, but their exotic ingredients, flamingo tongues, dormice, imported spices, were as much about display and social status as taste. The concept of snacking as both sustenance and social statement survived the fall of Rome. By the Middle Ages, pastries, sweetened breads, and honey-based desserts had become staples in monasteries, taverns, and royal courts, carrying forward Roman ingenuity in portability, preservation, and sweetness. The spread of Roman culinary practices via trade routes and conquest also left its mark. Ingredients like figs, dates, and nuts traveled far beyond Italy. Honey-sweetened pastries inspired medieval confections. Fermented drinks evolved into beers, meads, and wines across Europe. Even modern snack bars and confectionaries owe a debt to these early experiments in combining energy, flavor, and shelf life. The principle remains the same. Pack maximum sustenance into minimum effort while keeping the customer or soldier or laborer satisfied. Yes, your modern granola bar may come in a wrapper and not contain a surprise pebble or insect, but the concept of portable calories? Pure Roman genius. Roman snacking also left lessons about resourcefulness and adaptation. Street vendors sold what they could source locally, made the best use of spoilable ingredients, and invented combinations that maximized flavor while minimizing cost. Dates from the desert, figs from sun-baked orchards, nuts gathered in the countryside, leftover bread transformed into snackable loaves. Romans mastered the art of the edible hack. Today, food trucks, pop-up stalls, and street-side bakeries continue this tradition, making use of local ingredients, seasonal flavors, and clever presentation to delight customers in a fraction of the time it took a Roman baker to knead dough with their bare hands. Then, there's the eternal human desire to celebrate with food. Roman festivals demonstrated that snacks weren't just functional, they were joy. Sugar, or honey, was celebration. Pastries were art, and sharing food with neighbors was a form of communion. That joy resonates today in modern festivals, fairs, and street markets, where people come together for the sensory thrill of food, music, and chaos. Romans set the template. Celebrate, eat, and overindulge in public, ethically, ceremoniously, and sometimes dangerously sticky. Stickiness is part of the fun, right? If your fig brick can glue your fingers together for an hour, you're officially Roman. Finally, Roman snacks leave us with lessons in creativity. What other civilization would dare to transform barley, dates, and honey into bricks, balls, and pastries that could survive a sun-baked day in the Forum or feed soldiers marching across Gaul? They embraced messy, flavorful, and ambitious snacking long before modern nutritionists and chefs tried to sanitize every bite. Fermentation, frying, sweetening, and presentation. They combined science, art, and pure audacity. And somehow, through all the mess, the sand, and the occasional rogue insect, they made food fun, functional, and gloriously memorable. One slip on a honey-soaked pastry, and suddenly your sandals are sticky, your tunic is ruined, and your dignity is in ancient Roman court custody. But hey, it's a snack, not a moral failing. So, as you unwrap your chocolate bar or rip open a granola pack, consider the centuries of experimentation, improvisation, and occasional bravery baked, fried, fermented, and boiled into that snack. Romans weren't just eating. They were engineering, entertaining, and experimenting with every bite. They created a culture where snacking was strategic, ceremonial, social, and sometimes slightly terrifying. Without their influence, we might still be gnawing on stale bread without honey, sipping water from questionable aqueducts, and wondering why life tastes bland. As we look at Roman snacks, we also glimpse the broader society. Street vendors, festival goers, laborers, nobles, they all interacted through food. It was a language of sustenance, a ritual, a form of entertainment, and a means of survival. Romans may have been inventive, indulgent, or slightly reckless in their culinary experiments, but they understood something timeless. Food is about connection. Sharing a fig brick or sipping mulsum was social glue. Eating together, even in a crowded, noisy marketplace, reinforced bonds, celebrated abundance, and marked moments in time. So, what's the takeaway for us, centuries later? Well, for one, we can appreciate the sheer creativity of ancient Romans. Their snacks were portable, practical, and often absurdly delicious. They remind us that even when life is tough, when labor is grueling, the sun is scorching, and hygiene is questionable, humans will find joy in food. And they will share it, embellish it, and ritualize it. From street stalls to temples, from laborers to emperors, Roman snacks brought people together, fueled ambition, and occasionally set teeth on edge. Imagine trading 3 jars of garum for a loaf of bread. That's roughly like bartering Bitcoin for a hot dog today. And yes, that's historically accurate in the what the Romans found delicious sense. Finally, remember this. The essence of snacking hasn't changed. We may have plastic wrappers instead of clay jars, chocolate bars instead of fig bricks, and soda instead of mulsum. But the principle remains. Food satisfies hunger, fosters connection, and brings a tiny, momentary escape from the grind. The Romans just did it with a little more flair, and occasionally a lot more sand. So as you nibble on your modern treats, whether it's a cookie, a granola bar, or a questionable vending machine snack, take a moment to tip your imaginary Roman baker. The ingenuity, the indulgence, and yes, the messiness of Roman snacks laid the foundation for our modern obsessions with sweets, street food, and festival treats. Every sticky hand, every spiced bite, and every ferociously dense date brick whispers, we knew what we were doing, and it was delicious. Enjoy your snacks responsibly, but remember, Rome did it first. Subscribe to explore more strange, delightful, and sometimes sticky moments from history. And with that, dear viewer, you can close your eyes, let your imagination wander through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, smell the honey, taste the figs, and drift off, knowing that snack history has never been so sticky, sweet, or surprisingly relatable.